Welcome to a special programme on the missing Flight MH370.
Flight MH370 ended in the southern Indian Ocean.
Malaysia's Prime Minister delivers the news that the families of the 239 passengers and crew on board had been dreading. The breakthrough came as a result of unprecedented analysis by a British satellite company. We'll be there live. And as the search for MH370 enters a new phase, we'll have the latest from Kuala Lumpur, Beijing and from Perth in Western Australia.
Plus, I'll be joined by search, satellite and maritime experts for in-depth analysis of the challenges facing the investigation as it moves from rescue to recovery. That's from 7:30.
Well, tonight on Sky News, the biggest developments so far in the investigation into what may have happened to missing Flight MH370. The Malaysian Prime Minister confirmed that it did come down in the southern Indian Ocean. That announcement came after an unprecedented analysis of satellite data by a British company. Shortly after, relatives of those on board were told the plane had been lost. No one had survived. Our first report tonight comes from Alex Rossi in Kuala Lumpur. It contains flash photography.
Ladies and gentlemen, members of the media, the Honourable Prime Minister of Malaysia.
The choreography suggested the news would be bad, and it was. The Malaysian Prime Minister had called this unscheduled press conference late at night. He announced that based on new calculations from satellite data, MH370 was lost beyond doubt, and all its 239 passengers and crew were no longer alive.
I was briefed by representatives from the UK Air Accidents Investigation Branch, or AAIB. They informed me that Inmarsat, the UK company that provided the satellite data, which indicated the northern and southern corridors, has been performing further calculations on the data. Using a type of analysis never before used in an investigation of this sort, they have been able to shed more light on MH370's flight path. Based on their new analysis, Inmarsat and the AAIB have concluded that MH370 flew along the southern corridor and that its last position was in the middle of the Indian Ocean, west of Perth. This is a remote location, far from any possible landing sites. It is therefore with deep sadness and regret that I must inform you that according to this new data, Flight MH370 ended in the southern Indian Ocean.
The search will now intensify in the place where the plane went down. The British satellite company Inmarsat says the new analysis of its data is conclusive. Computer triangulation of the electronic pings, automated signals sent by the aircraft show the Boeing 777 crashed in the southern Indian Ocean.
We have worked these numbers from our data as hard as we possibly can. We can give you a likely area of the Southern Ocean, but we can't, because this plane wasn't tracked, we can't tell you exactly where to look. That will be for the ships at sea, the aircraft in the air, and obviously the spy satellites that have been trying to contribute as well.
Searching such isolated waters, though, is demanding work. But this Australian flight crew may have made a breakthrough in finding pieces of the aircraft or its cargo. They're dropping flares where they've sighted debris to help guide naval vessels.
We're looking for debris in the water, and we've sighted a number of objects, both on the surface and beneath the surface. First object was rectangular in shape, slightly below the ocean. Second object was circular, also slightly below the ocean. We came across a long, or a cylindrical object that was probably maybe 2 metres, possibly 2 metres long, about 30 centimetres across. We came across another piece of, or another item in the area that was also cylindrical and shaped in a rough fish hook.
The Australian naval ship Success is now steaming towards the site to retrieve the objects. It's the only way investigators can know for sure whether it's significant or just maritime rubbish drifting in the ocean currents.
The ship's company are acutely aware that there are families of 239 people who are on board that aircraft, and we see it as our role to do whatever we can to provide them the answers that they deserve.
With so many military assets in the area, there's a real sense they're close to uncovering some of the wreckage from the flight. The search area now covers around 26,000 square miles. It's just over 1,500 miles southwest of Perth. Australian aircraft spotted up to 4 floating objects within the search area. Earlier today, Chinese search aircraft reported a sighting of other suspicious objects. 2 relatively big white and square items. They were dispersed amongst several smaller ones. But an American Navy search plane has been unable to relocate them. At first lights then, these aircraft will be back out, but the search for the wreckage could take years. And at the moment there are still more questions than answers. Until the black box or flight data recorder is recovered, the mystery remains as to why Flight MH370 went miles off course and crashed into the ocean. Alex Rossi, Sky News, Kuala Lumpur.
Well, Alex then updated us with the latest from Kuala Lumpur.
A dramatic day here. I suppose in many ways, Mark, this was the surprise that everybody was kind of expecting. How could this flight have disappeared for so long and still the people on board, the passengers and the crew still being okay? But quite clearly the Malaysian authorities have been on the back foot. They've struggled with this operation, the scale of it, since the very beginning, not realising, of course, that the plane tracked back, banking west across the Malaysian peninsula. They picked it up on their own military radar, but they didn't realise that for 7 days, looking in the wrong place all of that time, squandering an opportunity to find the plane very early on. It's been other organisations, other countries that have really led this from the start. The British company in Masat, and now in the search corridor in the southern part of the South Indian Ocean, the Australians. A huge multinational operation is now going on down there. The military assets, the naval vessels that were currently searching in the northern corridor are now being diverted to the south. They will arrive in the next few days, possibly a week or so. And then the real nitty-gritty bit, the really difficult task of recovering the rest of the wreckage. And as you heard in my report, the flight data recorder, the black boxes. Until they find those, until they can lay their hands on them, they won't solve the mystery of what happened to this flight.
But this was the news that many relatives of the passengers on board had dreaded. Sky's Jonathan Samuels is with some of them in Beijing, as they were told. His report does include some pictures of distressed family members.
More than 2 weeks of hoping have ended just how they feared. Some react with bewilderment. Others can barely stand in their anguish. All are struggling. As they left the hotel's ballroom after the statement, a stream of grieving faces became a deluge of despair. Supported by loved ones, this woman screams that she's lost 3 members of her family: her son, his wife, and her grandson. "I beg you, it can't be like this," she cries. "That's the end of my family line." 3 generations are gone. I beg you to bring them back. The news that their relatives on the flight will never return meant some collapsed and had to be taken to hospital. For others, their pain turned to anger.
For nearly 2.5 weeks, the families have gathered in this hotel. Every day they hoped for a positive result, but it wasn't to be.
This TV reporter read the text many relatives had received. Malaysia Airlines deeply regrets that we have to assume beyond any reasonable doubt MH370 has been lost, it said. Many may now fly to Australia to be a little closer to the centre of their grief. They know their loved ones won't come back. Now they ask why and how.
Well, let's go live now to Perth, the base for the Air and Sea searchers, to speak to Simon Buddha from 9 News. Simon, how does this now affect those search operations? Because clearly they've still got to recover some kind of physical evidence, debris, from the surface of the sea itself.
Well, that's right, Mark. They've got to get that evidence. They've got to prove that wreckage that has been spotted, if it is in fact from the MH370, is part of what they're looking for. Now, those 2 items that were mentioned in that article, the grey or green circular item, the orange rectangular item, if they can be recovered and examined and found to be from the MH370, well, that'll be the evidence, and I'm sure families and relatives want to hear. They want to have proof that this plane has in fact crashed. Now, HMAS Success, as you said, is steaming into that region. The coordinates of that discovery was relayed from the P3 Orion back to the Rescue Coordination Centre. HMAS Success has those coordinates. They will be getting there. They've either got there overnight or they'll be getting there at first light this morning to try and recover those items. But I think, if anything, this will intensify the search in the southern Indian Ocean. In fact, there's a US black box detector on its way from America, which will help with that. But I guess the key to this is how far, if those bits of debris are from the MH370, how far they've drifted. I guess that's got to be backtracked. The currents have got to be backtracked. It's 17 days since the plane disappeared. They could have travelled hundreds of kilometres from the crash site in that time if they are from that plane. So there's a lot of work to be done yet before they find the precise location of where the MH370 went into the Indian Ocean.
Yeah, clearly that the concentration now on the marine efforts, if you like, perhaps underwater, oceanographic, effectively an undersea search. What sort of kit does Australia have that could help in that particular part of the investigation?
I think the equipment that the Navy has is very capable of the job ahead of it, although I'm sure this is an international effort. There are vessels from all over the world, Chinese vessels steaming into the region. Malaysian Navy will also be coming into this region. So I'm sure that they'll be throwing everything they can at trying to locate that black box and try and get some idea of exactly what happened. And that's why the American black box detector is such an important tool to be coming out of the States, because that will obviously help in that effort. But as I said earlier, they've got to find where the plane went in, and that's all to do with the currents. Oceanographers know the southern Indian Ocean is a perilous bit of ocean, and the currents run so fast through there. With wind, they could travel, pieces could travel hundreds of kilometres a day. So they could be right off the mark. If they're looking at an area 2,500 kilometres from southwest from Perth, it may be off the coast of Western Australia, and that's further away again. So at this point in time, they're still looking for a needle in a haystack, but at least now they've got the clues. They've got that data, that satellite data that tracked it all the way into the Indian Ocean and the southern Indian Ocean, and they now have, hopefully, some debris from the plane. And if that is in fact from the plane, using that information, using the data from the satellite, they'll be hopefully able to pinpoint the crash site.
Simon, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, that news that the plane did indeed come down in the ocean, the most significant development in the investigation so far. As Simon was explaining, the focus now on identifying the precise location where it may have crashed and working out how it got there. David Bowden looks now at the direction the investigation will take now.
So, how did Inmarsat manage to determine beyond doubt that Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 crashed into a remote part of the southern Indian Ocean, where engineers analysed the minimal satellite data they had from the so-called electronic handshakes, the pings coming from the plane. Then they compared the shape and frequency of the signals it generated, the Doppler effect, to lots of other flights whose speed, direction and altitude were already known. And by matching the two sets of data, they've been able to say where the Malaysian airliner ended up more closely. Now, you may remember that Inmarsat was able to pick up that last electronic handshake at 8:11 a.m. And if we look at the plane's original flight path from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, then we know how much fuel was on board and how far the plane could have flown. Putting all of this information together, the search focused sharply on the area of the southern Indian Ocean. In parts of the ocean is more than 8,000 metres deep, around 26,000 feet, though in the area we now think the plane went down, it's about 3,500 metres deep. That's 11,500 feet. The currents in this region make it likely that any debris will have drifted in different directions. Now, the black box flight recorder could be thousands of feet down and anywhere in a huge area, and the debris could have drifted up to 24 miles a day. That's 168 miles in a week. A Pinger locator system has been flown in from the United States to begin searching for the flight data recorders, but time is against them.
Considering that it's going to take a couple of days to get that onto a ship in Perth, Australia, and probably about at least 5 days to get it out to the site, we have less than a handful of days before the nominal battery runs out. So the only real chance is if this Inmarsat information, which has just been announced by the Malaysian Prime Minister, can be precise enough, in addition to all the other clues, to come up with a really, really tight search box.
Well, today's crucial breakthrough in the investigation came as a result of pioneering work by a British satellite company. It performed unprecedented analysis of satellite signals to provide the confirmation that the flight had come down in the Indian Ocean. And we're joined now from the company's headquarters in the city by spokesman Chris McLaughlin. Chris, thanks very much indeed for joining us. As we've seen, it appears to be similar to a sort of sonar signal you get underwater, the ping returning from the hull of a submarine, for instance. You've done that with the flight path of the plane in the sky.
Yes, you're right. And what we were doing was looking at the once-an-hour pings between the classic aero terminal built onto the aircraft and the network. So the network was looking to see if service was required, and after the last ACARS information came off the aircraft on Saturday the 8th, the only information to come off the aircraft has been that ping. Sadly, there was no position data because it's not mandated in that region, and therefore it's been a bit of a whodunit to try to find out where that aircraft has gone.
And how difficult has it been for you to actually get a definitive answer, to go to the Malaysian authorities and actually say, this is what's happened?
Clearly, we have only been able to make a contribution rather than the definitive answer. This has never been done before. We were just using a single third-generation Inmarsat satellite over the Indian Ocean, and we were trying to use Doppler effect, as you said earlier, Doppler effect technology calculations to see whether the aircraft was moving, and if so, whether we could deduce which direction. Subsequently, what we've been doing over the last 6 days or so is looking at previous Malaysian 777 flights to build a picture of how it interacted with the satellite in its position over the Indian Ocean. And what we discovered was that the southern projected route corresponds heavily with the pings that we got off the aircraft. The northern route doesn't, and therefore yesterday we advised the air crash investigation that we believed the southern route was the right way. That was following a peer review of people in the UK space industry who looked at our technology and our calculations, and indeed working closely with Boeing, who gave us information on how the aircraft would most likely have been flying. It's been a joint effort, but yeah, I should acknowledge the work of our Inmarsat scientists.
And crucially, all this data suggests that the plane was flying, straight and level, i.e. it was under some kind of control.
Well, the assumption, and it's only an assumption, is that the aircraft headed south under autopilot at approximately 450 knots, which is the autopilot speed. We cannot know what happened in the last hour after the last ping. There's just no reported data. We can't know if it speeded up, dropped in speed. We can't know at what point it ran out of fuel, but we can know that last hour direction of travel.
So, crucially for this continuing air and sea search now, we don't know whether it would have hit the water intact or whether it may have broken up mid-air, because clearly that will be a huge difference for the debris field to be examined.
Yes, obviously that's not an area that Inmarsat has expertise in. I think it's more for Boeing to consider what happens if a plane is on autopilot and runs out of fuel. Does it plunge or does it glide? Obviously we at Inmarsat are not equipped to speculate on that one.
Well, Chris, thank you very much indeed for your expert opinion anyway. Thanks for joining us here on Sky News tonight. And just to remind you that there's more in our special report on the search so far, and all of today's dramatic developments coming up later at 8:30, again here on Sky News. And also much more on Sky News for iPad, with the latest images from the air search here for MH370, the latest maps and background to the story itself. You can use that app for free if you're a Sky TV customer. Well, there's some very public scenes of anguish in Beijing today as the relatives of those on board the missing flight were told finally that their loved ones would not be coming back. It's an emotion that will be recognised by John Clements, who lost his brother Brad in the Air France Flight 447 in June 2009. He joins us now in the studio. John, thank you very much indeed for joining us on this occasion. Clearly they've gone through the ringer emotionally, not knowing what had happened, getting misinformation, hopes dashed, and now finally the confirmation. How on earth do people try to assimilate all that?
Well, it's extremely difficult, of course. This is going to be a terrible blow to the families. There'll be a number of them that had been holding out hope that there was still a chance that their loved ones would be alive, and that hope has now been dashed. And I think what the families need to do now is to isolate themselves and have a bit of grieving in sort of private and peacefully.
Has that been an additional difficulty, that so much of this has been played out in the public arena before the cameras?
Yes, absolutely. It's the Malaysian authorities don't seem to have coordinated their effort very well. It's been essential for them to gain the confidence of the families and to be very organized and transparent in giving out the information. That doesn't seem to be the case. They've lost the confidence of the families. The information's been given out sort of any old way by different people and different authorities, and I think that's just really augmented the difficulties for the families.
Yeah, I mean, very difficult scenes here at the hotel in Beijing where they were finally given the news. It does appear that with all the issues of hunger strikes being planned and so on, that they'd lost confidence in those in authority who were giving them the information.
Absolutely, and that was an essential step that the Malaysian authorities had to do, was to make sure they gained the confidence of the families. This is going to be a long and difficult search with a lot of sort of unknowns and very difficult circumstances that are going to unroll. And it was essential for them to have a good relationship with the families, or as good as can be expected under the circumstances.
You had to wait, some 2 years really for final confirmation. What happens in that time? And do you actually clutch at any straws? Do you wait until you get official information before reacting to it? How do you deal with it?
Well, our case was a little different than the Malaysian Airlines, of course, because there was some debris found after 5 days, and we had some messages that indicated there were mechanical problems. So we pretty much knew after the first few days that it had ended in the ocean and there was no hope. So here, when there's so little information, it's going to be normal for the families to have a certain amount of hope, and they'll be grasping at straws up at least until today. I mean, the
theories that it may have landed intact, someone they were being held hostage, and all those sort of conspiracy theories that were doing the rounds.
Well, that, and then the government's been giving out other things about it. Might have been a suicide because of the pilot being a supporter of the opposition party and things like that, which is just not very helpful at all. Speculation with absolutely no basis to them.
What's the process now? Because very often, I gather, the families do come together. They share the difficulties, the emotions as well, but also to try and push maybe the authorities to not only find out exactly what happened, even prevent such disasters in future?
Well, certainly in a case like with ours and in this one, when there isn't the wreckage and the black box is found immediately. When that is the case, of course, it's very simple to allow the authorities to do their job. But here, there's going to have to be a whole long process. The authorities are going to want to give up. They're going to be going off in different directions. And I think it's very important for the families to become an actor at the table. They need to organize themselves and become a respected actor so that they can have interaction with the other authorities and to be a sort of a check to make sure that everything's transparent and goes ahead.
How easy was that for you to organise after the Air France crash?
Well, it's extremely difficult because, as you can imagine, the families come from all sorts of different countries and different backgrounds and different cities, and so they don't know each other.
And there's no template on what to do, I guess.
No, absolutely, and they don't know each other, and they have to come together and try to coordinate their activities. So that's a real challenge. But if you can do that properly, then for the authorities, in some ways, it's better, because then they can have an actor that they can talk to instead of having the kind of scenes that we've seen in Beijing where it just gets out of control.
John, thank you very much indeed for joining us here in the studio tonight. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, today's announcement by Malaysia's Prime Minister was the most significant breakthrough so far in the mystery of Flight MH370. But it's just the beginning, perhaps, of a new phase of the investigation. Sarah Hewson's gathered a panel of experts to assess where that investigation goes and where its focus will be next.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, significant developments today, but still a long way to go in the hunt for MH370. I'm joined by John Lindsay, who's the former head of air safety at British Airways, Professor Misha Dola, an expert in wireless communications from King's College London, and oceanographer Dr. Simon Boxall. The focus of the search for the missing flight MH370 is clearly now the southern Indian Ocean. It's centred around two locations totalling around 26,000 square miles, each about 1,500 miles off the coast of Australia. So how did Inmarsat manage to determine, beyond doubt, that Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 crashed into a remote part of the southern Indian Ocean? Well, engineers analysed the minimal satellite data they had from the so-called electronic handshakes or pings coming from the plane. Then they compared the shape and frequency of the signals it generated, the Doppler effect, to lots of other flights whose speed, direction and altitude were already known. And by matching the two sets of data, they've been able to say where the Malaysian airliner ended up more closely. Now, you may remember that Inmarsat was able to pick up that last electronic handshake at 8:11 a.m. And if we look at the plane's original flight path from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, then we know how much fuel was on board and how far the plane could have flown. Putting all of the information together, the search focused sharply on this area of the southern Indian Ocean. Well, let's talk a little bit more about that development today with Professor Misha Dola. Why has it taken so long for the satellite information that we've had to be analysed, to be able to give us this decisive point that it did come down in the southern Indian Ocean?
Well, Inmarsat had the satellite information from their satellite, which is probably somewhere located here, all the time. The engineers have been crunching the data from day one. I think day two they already figured out it must have been the arcs, which we have seen later on, passed on the data. Later more experts came in, flight experts from Boeing itself, to calculate really the possible flying time. They started to crunch the Doppler data actually, so that allowed them to compare the signatures, so they knew it hadn't gone actually to the north. They suspected...
But I mean, even up until yesterday, they were still searching in the northern corridor, weren't they? It's only today that we've been told definitively it did come down.
So I'm not sure we can put it on Inmarsat. I think Inmarsat probably knew with the high reliability that's gone south for quite a while already. So you may want to leverage this back to the governments and to the search organisations.
How accurate can they be from the data that has been analysed, all of that information that's been crunched? How accurate can they be about exactly where that plane did come down?
If you look from outer space, it's very exact. Now, as you come down to Earth, it's becoming wider and wider. So the search area, clearly the satellite precision, what they could work out is plus minus 100 kilometers, which is just still a very big area to search in.
Who was involved in this? You were saying that Boeing was involved, John Lindsay, so the airline itself involved, and they were comparing other airline information. They were also looking at the fuel consumption on the plane.
Absolutely, that would be fundamental. Having got this range arc, this circle, both to the north and the south, then that gives a line with certain width on the map or on their charts. But to determine how far down that arc the airplane may have travelled, then they will have crunched the data on that to see what its endurance would have been from the point that it turned off its original track, the likely fuel load, and the altitude that it was flying at, the wind at altitude, and then they would be able to create a bracket on that arc which says this is the furthest extreme and this would be the nearest extreme, and so it then refines that area. Still a very big area.
And Misha, we know there's been a lot of criticism of the Malaysian authorities for squandering opportunities, for being too slow to respond to the information. Their justification is that actually this level of information wouldn't normally be relied on. We've got so little to work with. So how significant is what Inmarsat and Boeing and the others have been doing?
Well, I think that it's probably the most significant piece of information they had, actually, to be honest, because transponders were off, they're off the primary radar area, voice comms was off, ACARS was off, so there's a lot of stuff which was not responding, either, been switched off or really there was a technical problem. So the satellite ping was actually really the best data they had. So they should have relied on this really from day one much more.
So they should have used that information more quickly.
I presume they have used it, but because there's so much uncertainty from different angles, they worked through a probabilistic model, I would presume, and the probability it had gone north was not zero. Yeah, so you still would, because operationally there are two different crews, there's totally different equipment which is needed to look in an ocean or look over land. There's no harm in replicating this, frankly speaking. But I think we had the indication all the time it's gone south.
OK, so that development today establishing that the flight did end in the southern Indian Ocean. Now they need to locate that missing aircraft. As we know, there have been various reports of debris in that area and a huge search operation going on. So what kinds of planes have been involved in the search so far? First of all, we're looking for a Boeing 777 airliner. It's very popular with a number of airlines across the world as a long-haul jet. The planes that are searching for it include the P-3 Orion. It's been around since the 1960s. It's very good at flying low, skimming the surface of the oceans, looking down for objects. Of course, it can also fly all the way there and back, but it can only spend a couple of hours on station. They've also got a state-of-the-art P-8 Poseidon. This American plane has only been going for a couple of years. It's an anti-submarine detector, so it can look beneath the waves. That is, of course, crucial because some, if not all, of the wreckage will have sunk to the bottom of the ocean. There are also non-military planes operating out there as well. There are two Bombardier Global Expresses. These are executive jets, if you like, but they are intercontinental. The key here is that they can fly a long time. And if you fly them over with people looking out of the window, they might see some debris as well.
Well, it has taken a long time to actually ascertain where the aeroplane crashed, and it's going to take even longer to find the flight data recorders. And from the Pilots Association, we'll be very keen to work with civil aviation authorities, airlines, the manufacturers, to try and find a better way of tracking the aeroplanes so that we don't have to wait quite so long in the future when an aeroplane has crashed before we can actually find it. It needs to be a global solution so that all aircraft are carrying an ability to be tracked, and therefore it'll take a lot of coordination between governments and airlines and manufacturers to come up with a solution that all aeroplanes could use.
So that's the planes that are being used here. There's also ships in the area, Dr. Simon Boxall.
Obviously, the planes can identify potential debris. So far, we've seen satellite images, we've seen potential sightings from the aircraft, the Chinese aircraft, the Australian aircraft. But at the end of the day, you need a ship on the ground to collect this debris to see whether the debris relates to the missing aircraft. The ocean's full of debris, and most of the stuff they're picking up is likely to be false positives. And so until they can identify absolutely that the debris they're seeing comes from the aircraft, they can't start the search on the seabed because they need to pinpoint to to a much higher precision, that search.
So first on the scene, HMAS Success, the Australian vessel, also on its way, a British vessel, HMS Echo. What are their capabilities to look for this debris on the surface?
Primarily, to start with, they're using visible signs.
So it's human search?
It's human search, and it is doing a very detailed grid pattern based firstly on what the aircraft has seen so far. The Australian aircraft also deployed buoys, and those buoys will transmit locations, and hopefully they'll go with the flow, hopefully with the debris that was seen, and it will help the ship focus in on that debris.
John Lindsay, the debris that was spotted today, the Chinese talked about seeing a suspicious white object. The Australians saw several objects of different shapes and sizes. What do you make of those sightings?
I would say that it's positive that there have been so many bits of debris now sighted, but as Simon was saying, that there's a lot of sort of flotsam and jetsam out on the ocean, and really it requires a ship, as Simon says, to actually get hold, to touch one of those pieces of debris, bring it on board, and then examine it minutely and see what its identity is, whether it actually came from the aircraft in question.
Presumably, Misha, satellite images still being analysed to try and pinpoint areas where there might be debris. We've already had several images over the past week or so.
Yeah, so satellites, there's a different set of satellites now. They're not geostationary. They fly all the time over Earth, a little bit lower. And they produce different, so optical images type of data. There's also the French satellite, which is picking up radar data from the surface. So we have a vast amount of data we have to crunch really in real time, try to figure out what is wave, what is, something, and what is plane.
And what about the capabilities of the planes? The American plane you were telling me about that has sonar capability.
Yes, so Poseidon actually has sonar capabilities, so they can look under the surface. They can't really look down to the ground. But sound waves happen to travel really well within water, not so much in air. So as what they fly, sound wave hits the ocean. Some of that goes down into the water. If there's something down there, that could actually it reflects off, comes back into the plane, and they can analyze that. Up to 300 meters about in depth.
And what about the crucial black box recorders emitting a signal for, 30 days?
30 days. I read a report, this specific one, probably 35 days, so they got 5 days more. Problem is, of course, it's about, we have, professionals here. It's, if you're unlucky, it's just about 1 kilometre, 2 kilometres range it will have. If it has actually fallen below that range, it's very difficult to pick it up unless you have a submarine.
And John Lindsay, we keep talking about these black box recorders. Why are they so significant and crucial here?
Well, there are a number of boxes that will be of interest to the crash investigators. There's first of all the crash recorder, which records a lot of parameters about how the aeroplane was flying, how it was being flown. If they can get hold of the quick access recorder and it hasn't been damaged, that will be truly crucial, because that has thousands of parameters recorded on it. And some of these parameters are sampled like 5 times a second during flight. So it provides a lot of data. And the other crucial item will be the cockpit voice recorder, because the other 2 recorders will tell how the aeroplane flew to where it did, but it won't say why. And if the cockpit voice recorder is recovered intact and is one of the long-duration recorders, then that may tell the investigators why. But I would point out that it would have to be a long-duration recorder, because, unfortunately, many of the cockpit voice recorders only have 30 minutes recording duration, and then it's a rewinding tape, and it will start all over again. So if the aircraft was not actually being flown under human control for the last few hours of its flight, then there probably wouldn't have been any conversation to record.
So we keep talking about them as being the key and holding the secrets here, but you're saying that actually it's a lot more complicated than that. OK. Captain John Lindsay, Professor Misha Dola and Dr Simon Boxall, thanks very much indeed for your time. This is Sky News. Welcome back to the Situation Room. The search for missing flight MH370 is now heading underwater. One of the big problems for the search teams is the depth of the water in the southern Indian Ocean, which goes down to 8,000 metres in some areas. That's over 25,000 feet almost as deep as Mount Everest is high. Chinese aircraft report seeing suspicious objects about 1,500 miles from Perth within the existing search zones. That's after images from an American satellite emerged earlier this week showing possible debris, and Chinese satellite pictures of a similar object just 70 miles southwest of the American sighting. It's also been revealed that a French satellite spotted an object here 530 miles north of the other sightings. For now, though, the search is focused here, where the sea is between 2,000 and 4,000 metres deep, around 6,500 to 13,000 feet. That means there is hope for more information, at least because the 777's black box recorder is designed to keep working at depths of up to 6,000 metres. That's 20,000 feet. And here are the images from the US satellite taken earlier on this week, spotting debris. Today we've had search planes going out to the area. Chinese plane identified a suspicious-looking object in the search area, some 1,500 miles off the coast of Perth, and then Australian planes spotted several objects, two of them cylindrical, one rectangular, an orange item of debris spotted in the ocean. The challenge now is to retrieve those items. So with me here in the Situation Room, David Mearns, who's a deep water search and recovery expert. Oceanographer Dr. Simon Boxall has stayed in here with me, and Captain John Noble, who's a marine salvage expert. No longer a search and rescue operation. This is all about recovery now. How complicated a task is that, Captain Noble?
Once they've found the debris in the seabed, the actual recovery is not that difficult. It's well within known capabilities. The controlling things will be the weather and the stamina of those there to do the recovery. But getting the bits up is relatively straightforward. Finding the right bits, like the flight recorders, could be more difficult. That could take time.
What poses the greatest difficulties then in trying to find it? Once they find things on the surface, Dr. Simon Boxall, that doesn't correspond with what might be directly underneath, does it? They could be very
Those things
distances.
they've been drifting around with the currents over the past 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, depending on when they finally find any surface debris. And so trying to backtrack that to where the plane might have gone in, the area of impact is still very broad, about the size of the North Sea, and trying to narrow that down is very difficult. And as time goes on, any debris found at the surface becomes more and more dispersed. It becomes more and more difficult to work out where the bulk of the wreck will be on the seabed.
16 days in now. David Mearns, you were an advisor after the Air France crash off Brazil in 2006, and I wonder, 2009, sorry, June 2009. They found the debris then 5 days later, but it was 2 years before the black box recorders could be located and retrieved. What is it that takes all of that amount of time?
Well, that took a lot of time because actually they were searching in the wrong place. And,
so even once they found debris,
that's
they
correct.
Didn't know where to look.
And like the professor has indicated, with time, the debris spreads out in a never-increasing cone away from the origin point. And in this instance, after 16 days, it's actually probably going in such different areas that it could be caught up in some of these eddies and meanders. So you can have drift patterns that are completely unrelated to each other. And while we didn't have that with Air France, it was more or less straight. If you're going to search in the wrong place, you're not going to find it. And so in 2009 and 2010, the search, unfortunately, was directed in the wrong place. And it wasn't until 2011 when a different idea in terms of the search, where it should be directed, when that was implemented, we found the wreckage inside of a week. So there's a big difference there.
You also have experience of the Indian Ocean because you were part of a team that recovered the Boeing 747 South African Airways flight that had crashed in 1987. What about the conditions here?
Well, in this instance, the weather conditions, like Captain Noble indicated, is going to be one of the real problems. It's an incredibly remote area, so it's going to take, these salvage vessels, they're not very fast. They steam at about 10 to 12 knots, so it's going to take you 5 to 6 days to get from Perth one way. So if you're going out for 30 or 45 days, generally it's 30 days. 12 of those days are just steaming time. So you're losing a lot of time right off the beginning and moving around. And then if you're having inclement weather for half of that time, then your operational effectiveness is really cut down. That's the main problem. We didn't have that problem so much on the South African project because we were only a day out of port and it was far further north. It was just off the coast of Mauritius.
So the location of this is complicating factors.
It's about, if you were going to lose a plane in an area that you didn't want people to find, this is probably the best place in the world to pick.
Yeah, I mean, what is there? I mean, somebody was asking me earlier, well, aren't there submarines and can't they find it?
Submarines can't. They don't go that deep. I think people think that satellites see the entire planet continuously.
And that submarines see the entire
can go to the
floor.
seabed. They don't go very deep, and they barely scratch the surface. So they're not going to see the sea floor. You need to use survey ships, and it's a slow process. It's like trying to paint the Forth Road Bridge with a child's paintbrush. It's going to take that time.
What kind of tools will be used on the ocean floor, Captain John Noble?
Well, they will use remote-operated vehicles with a side-scan sonar capability, and they will have to analyse that information, which will be very slow. And we do have to remember that the seabed, as has been pointed out, is not flat. So it's like Mount Everest and the Alps combined, if you can imagine the hillsides there, and then trying to find small bits of debris. So it is an immense task.
And this is a recovery operation. They're looking for wreckage, but they're also looking, aren't they, David Mearns, for the bodies of those who are on board, and for the families who were given that news today. They are desperate to get their loved ones back.
That's correct. And I was just speaking to the brother of somebody who was lost on Air France, John, and
John Clements, whose brother
right.
Brad died.
And some of my friends were actually involved in the recovery of those bodies, and he wanted me to make sure that they knew how much the families appreciated. He said the moment we actually heard that the wreck had been found, they celebrated, and even though that doesn't seem quite... they're reliving this personal tragedy, but that gave them the moment that they could actually get somebody back to bury them.
OK, David Mearns, Dr Simon Boxall and Captain John Noble, thanks very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you. So confirmation from the Malaysian Prime Minister that the flight has come down in the southern Indian Ocean. The announcement coming after unprecedented analysis of satellite data.